Thank you all very much for coming out this evening. It's great to see you, and it's not 119, right? I know it's a cool snap. I told Karin we were in the middle of a cool snap just for her. Thank you, virtual audience, for joining us. So tonight, Isabella Maldonado is going to be in conversation with Karin Slaughter over here. I'm sure you know which one is which, but just in case. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. All right, so I wanted to start by saying when I was reading the book, that the one that just came out, obviously the first thing when I opened it up is I have to tell you that you win the award for the creepiest opening to a book. Tell me a little bit about that, about what made you want to open it the way you did.
Well, when I wrote about Sarah in the Grant County novels, usually obviously something really awful always happens in the first chapter of my books. I mean, it's a wonder anybody wants to be in them. But I always love those scenes where Sarah just rolls up her sleeves and gets her hands dirty. And I wanted to do something, since I'd been away for a couple of novels, to remind people that I still know why you love Sarah. And so I thought, let me start this off with this really horrific thing that happens to a patient who's brought in. So this is 3 years before present day, when Sarah is still working at Grady Hospital, and she has a little flirtation with a guy named Will Trent she's interested in. And then we catch up with her 3 years later and see all the fallout. And obviously she's with Will, and they're very happy together until, of course, I have to have something horrible happen. But not that horrible. Don't worry about that. But I just thought, let's have this really exciting medical stuff happen right at the beginning, so you can see Sarah in action.
And there's really there's 3 openings to the book, because, first there's these text messages that are just, wow. I mean, if I got a text message like that, it would definitely give me pause. And I love that it draws the reader right into, I have to know what's going to happen to this Danny Cooper person. What is going on, and who is this guy? So right away, and then immediately you go straight into a heavy action scene. And then in the third sort of opening, then we're caught up, and it's 3 years later, and it's a court scene. So I love how you did that, and it's really great how you opened things that way, and readers love that, I think, to be engaged.
It's what I love about reading crime novels. There's just something that grabs you. And there are, throughout the book, several text messages that I put in there that are not too far off from horrible things I've read on the internet. We're living in a golden age for really creepy men showing how they do it all over the internet. If you're a woman, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it was kind of like a challenge to me to try to write in the voices of these really awful, creepy men. And it's weird because I started reading a lot of them, and I thought, wow, it's all like they're from the same playbook, right? They all do these certain things, and independent of each other, they've figured out how to be extremely awful to women. And I wanted to capture that.
And you did. But the thing is, and I can tell you, though, from actual experience, though, what you are writing is authentic. And I had been sort of talking about you behind your back before you came, and I was talking about, as a cop, I appreciate when you write the cops with all that compassion and all that feeling. And the dynamic between Sarah and Will, it's really amazing. And I think that it's really nice how you've drawn all that out. And I'm wondering, it's like in between all the mayhem and chaos, there's wedding plans going on, which is kind of like a nice counterbalance that you have going on here. So is the wedding going to be just as unconventional as everything else about them?
You'll have to see. I don't want to give us any spoiler. But the thing about Sarah and Will is and you probably know this in your own writing, it's very challenging to write about happy people. And it's one reason why Sarah is no longer in Grant County, because she was a little too happy. And I thought, okay, well, I probably shouldn't do that again, because so many people want to kill me still. But I wanted to have the tension come from outside. And a lot of books, and I love reading series books, but a lot of the tension between people comes from making up and breaking up and making up and breaking up. And that is a really easy thing to do if you're a writer. And I think I've proven I don't like the easy things. And so it's been a real challenge figuring out how to keep them happy. And if they disagree, it's not going to be the end of their relationship. But it will change the relationship in ways. And so that was really the fun of writing this book, is talking about their different perceptions of what should be done, what's the right thing to do, and how each of them tries to push the other into doing, the right thing or the best thing for them.
Yeah, and then actually speaking of like relationships between men and women, in the book, at one point you have one of the characters sort of make like a throwaway remark about, it feels like I'm in The Handmaid's Tale. And I love that. And I had seen that previously you mentioned that you are a fan of Margaret Atwood's work. And so I was going to ask, how does Margaret Atwood's work inspire you or influence you, and maybe specifically with this story, without giving too much away?
Well, I think we're all a little worried that we're going to be dressed as handmaidens eventually. But she's an amazing writer, and not just Handmaid's Tale, but I love her dystopian stuff. I love her fantasy stuff. I think her short stories are amazing. I think she's probably one of the most terrifying authors you could ever meet. I've never met her in person, but I've known authors who have, and they're never the same, because she's just so fiercely intelligent. But the thing, and I was going to meet her once at the London Book Fair, but her flight was delayed, and I was so relieved. But then someone told me this great story about her, and it was an Australian woman, so you know how they can be extremely blunt. And so she was going to an event at the Sydney Opera House to see Margaret Atwood speak, and she was standing in line for the toilet, because that's what you do. And she turns around, and there's Margaret Atwood. And she said to Margaret Atwood, "What are you doing here? Why are you in line?" And Margaret Atwood said, "I do urinate." And I thought, okay, well, that brings her down. We all have to go to the toilet. So she is a human being. But I do admire a lot of, we have like some really great female authors who have done some amazing things. And I grew up loving Flannery O'Connor, Margaret Atwood. I think a lot of it has inspired me to write. A lot of people will call it, and literary authors talk about fearlessness and finding your voice and all that shit. And for me, it's just like, when I read women who write like that, I think I want to be at that level. And it really makes me glad that I'm able to do what I do. And I look at it as a challenge to tell my stories in the same way.
It is. It's very inspirational to see that sort of thing. And but I definitely got like this sort of vibe, when I was reading through the book. And, so in that sense, I'll follow up and ask you about, maybe, again, without any spoilers, but what does the story sort of generally say about power and influence?
Well, so I don't think anybody who's read the series will think this is a surprise, because I write about it in Blindsided, the first novel with Sarah, that she was sexually assaulted when she was at medical school. And this takes us back to that time period for her and what it was like and what it did to her. And not just to her, but how it exploded her life, and it affected her family, her community, the people she worked with, the hospital she was working in. A lot of people left the hospital. Her pastor, her relatives, everybody around her was affected by this. And so, as someone who has written about sexual violence before, I wanted to put it in the context of Sarah, and not just what happens when the crime occurs, but after that night. How does she go on with her life? How does she rebuild it? And we catch up with her 15 years later, and she's still having to deal with what a lot of women do to other women, like what were you wearing? Why were you there? That those sort of judgmental things that we do to each other. And I'm sure if you were called to a murder as a police officer, you never said to the dead person's family, "Are you sure you want to investigate this? It's going to be really hard for you." But a lot of times police officers will say that. And I've talked to a lot of police officers who don't even believe rape is a crime that happens, despite the statistics. I had a cop who worked in a college town say that to me. It's just these girls, they have regret, and you think it's 2023. We all have regrets, but we don't care. We just have to go to class the next day. And so that was something I wanted to talk about in the novel. I was hearing a lot about people saying the Me Too backlash, which really irritated the crap out of me, because we had like 3 years out of 2000 where rape was really a bad thing and sexual assault and harassment was a bad thing, and no one was talking about the nuance of it. And so I wanted to put that through Sarah and just talk about what's happening in the world, and also make sure that if you're not interested in any of that, it's a really good thriller, page-turner kind of read, which is kind of a delicate balance, but hopefully I achieved that.
You did. And going through the plot, and that's what's interesting, because you have this very intricate plot that you're writing on many different levels, and then you're also keeping the emotional part in check too. So it made me wonder. I mean, every writer has their own different style, but I was going to ask you, when you're writing with all these complicated plots, do you have a chart that's kind of like the murder board that is on Sarah's refrigerator and then going on to her cabinets?
I don't. Probably as I get older, I probably should, because it's harder to hold all these things in my head. But when I write, I'm really clear about character and plot, and every author is different. Some will do outlines, some will draft and redraft and all that. And I'm not a drafter. When I sit down and write a scene or a chapter or whatever, I've thought about it in my head for a really long time. So by the time I sit down, I'm kind of just taking dictation for myself, and it lays out pretty quickly. One thing I always do is I know who the bad person is, so I can make sure that when I'm writing the novel, I'm playing fair with the reader. So if you guys can pay close attention, the clues are there to figure it out. But if you're also someone who can figure it out, I have to make sure the suspense is there so that you keep reading, even though, so that the point of the book isn't the whodunit, it's how and why. And that's really important for me to explain also, because people do things for reasons. And sometimes they're really stupid. Most of the time they're really stupid. I mean, prisons are full of people who made bad decisions, and then they tried to cover those up with more bad decisions, and it just kept compounding. And a lot of them made what you call poor people mistakes, and it just compounds things, and they end up in the system. And so I want to write about that on a larger level, because, when you write a thriller, unless you're Denise Mina, you can't really write about those petty criminals who do stupid things. But I wanted to put that in a larger story and talk about violence. And actually, if you read the book, which hopefully you will, you bought it anyway, it is loosely based on a case that fell apart in South Georgia. So a lot of times I'll try to take bits and pieces of things from real life, but I'm always very conscious that the crimes I write about happen to real people. So when I write, that's the thing that's first and foremost in my mind, is I need to respect this thing that I'm writing about, because there's someone out there who's had this happen.
Yeah, and that was another thing that we were talking about, is how you are so sensitive to the victims and their trauma and the aftermath of the crime. And something that you said just really, it really clicked and resonated with me. And one of the reasons that, people have asked me, why don't I write true crime? Because I could, obviously, having been in law enforcement, but I prefer fiction. And that is exactly what you're talking about, where it's like, I think the human mind struggles to make sense of things. And real, actual crime is often just senseless, pointless, horrible, violence. And so when you write fiction, and that's another reason, like you, I like to get into the mind of the perpetrator, because we all struggle to understand what would drive someone to do this. And I think it's satisfying for the readers to get an inkling of what that's like. And I was wondering what kind of research that you did about the criminal mind that helps you to really flesh out those characters as well as obviously the protagonists we all love.
Well, I mean, we should say that one of the great things about fiction for you also is the bad guys always get caught. They always get punished, which isn't the case in real life. And a lot of times the police know exactly who did it, but they can't prove it. And, if you're a good cop and you play by the rules, sometimes they get away and you hope they mess up again and you can get them that time. I think for me, I hate the datelines where they don't have a resolution. I feel like they should put a warning on that. Because I'm not going to watch it. Don't let me get invested in this if you don't have a resolution. So I've tried to do that in the books as well. I want to make sure that there's a resolution that feels satisfying and that feels realistic. But as far as getting in the minds of people, I mean, obviously, I'm not a murderer that you know of. But I think for a writer, it's kind of our job to think about what other people are doing and why they're doing things. And, I'm really horrible at like an airport when someone's really nasty. I'll kind of just stand there and watch because I wonder, wow, what's making you this nasty? And, I'm trying to figure it out. And of course, then they're nasty to me. But that's something that's always intrigued me, and maybe that comes from the fact that I grew up in Atlanta during the time of the Atlanta child murders, and I saw how it changed people. The fear of crime can make people nuts. And Atlanta is a perfect example of this. I've lived in Atlanta for over 20 years. I love living there. It's a very safe city. Like a lot of towns, the people killing each other are usually bad people killing bad people. And if you just stay away from the bad people, you're not going to get killed. I mean, there are obviously some exceptions, but it's a fairly safe city. But a lot of times you'll see on the news these news stories amplifying bad things that are happening, and people suddenly change. And they're very suspicious, and they're very withdrawn from people. And that's what I saw happen as a child with the Atlanta child murders. Everybody was looking at everybody suspiciously. And suddenly, I'm Gen X, so we were basically raised like feral hogs. But suddenly, we had to be in before the streetlights came on, and we had to, check in all the time during the day with our moms. And, it was really something that I became aware of, that bad things can happen to children, which most kids didn't know at that age. And that made me wonder, well, why would someone hurt a child, and why would someone do this, and why look at how much it's changed just here, and we're not related to these crimes in any way. And I think that gave me a curiosity and made me wonder, why would people break that social contract? And so when I write my books, I'm thinking about, well, what makes you think you have a right to do this, particularly with sexual assault? It never has anything to do with sex. It's always about the control and the violence and the fear and all those sorts of things that go into that kind of crime. And as I think from a very young age been aware of that. Every woman in this room has likely experienced some sexual harassment, unwanted sexual attention. I remember very clearly the first time I saw a man without his pants on. I was 9 years old. We were going to a field trip with my church. On the bus, all of us girls on the bus going to see the art at the museum, and this guy just dropped his pants in front of a school bus full of girls, and none of us ever told our parents. It never even occurred to us to tell the teacher or anything like that. And so that's just something that's always prevalent. And I wanted to write about those things, that we we kind of laugh about them, I think, because when women are like, oh, a guy just flashed me, or this guy just said he was going to rape me online or whatever, and we kind of laugh it off, or talk about, I was in the parking lot and I heard a noise and I thought I was going to be raped, and we make a joke about it, but it's something that we're all aware of and that we live with, and I wanted to kind of put down in words those things that we joke about.
You're right, every woman has, had some kind of tangential, if not direct experience in this sort of way. And I think it's really important that you actually, you put it out and you put the light on it and you focus on it. And I think that is very important that people have that. And I remember one of the comments that you made in another interview in the past, you had talked about how you just start writing and then you just go at it and you keep going until it's done. And I was wondering, do you feel like that momentum is part of what makes your readers want to start reading and not put the book down until it's done?
I hope so, because it kills me to do it that way. It's a bad way to do it. So I know there are people who want to be writers in the audience, and I love reading interviews with authors, and they're asked about the process, and they say, oh, I get up at the sunrise and I go do Pilates, and then I write for 4 hours, and then I drink some tea, and I'm like, fuck you. I get up, I'm in my pajamas all day, I'm writing for 16 hours a day, I get out of the chair and like every bone in my body aches, and then I sleep for 4 hours and I get up again, and I do that for 2 weeks at a time. And then I go home for a week and recover, and then I go back up. I have a cabin in the mountains I go to write, and then I'll go back up to the cabin, and I'll do it for another 2 weeks, and I keep doing it until it's done. But you can definitely see, like, when there's it's kind of like a roller coaster, and you can go, oh, Karen's at the cabin, oh, she's going back, oh, she's at the cabin. And that's worked for me, but I wish that I had incorporated Pilates into my routine. So does my physical therapist many years ago.
Yeah, unfortunately, I kind of write like that too. It's like a crazy, and yeah, I have to go see the chiropractor because my whole back is messed up at the end of all that. It's terrible. But I am curious about the writing retreat. What is that like up in the mountains?
Well, I don't even take my cats, because if you know cats, they're going to be on you when you're trying to work. And then when you want love, they're like, who are you? And I have a cabin in the North Georgia mountains that my dad built for me many years ago. And that's where I've primarily written my books. And I'll go up and, I'll get food, and it's just me there. And I mean, I have a television. I can't live like an animal. But I'll just be me and writing, and I don't answer emails. I don't have phone calls. I don't, the distractions that keep you from writing, like the UPS guy is there and you're like, hey, how you doing, bud? So I've always loved that isolation. And I think that as a writer, I thrive in that isolation. I've never been a go to a coffee house sort of writer. I just can't get distracted like that.
Maybe you're like, I have a little bit of ADHD, I think. And, if I was at a coffee shop, every bright, shiny object would get my attention. And
no, I'm just grumpy. If people were talking, I'd be like, yeah.
I'd want to know what they were saying. Absolutely. So now back to the story in this particular book. So, you've sort of already let it out a little bit that, this has to do with Sarah's past. And then, in the beginning, there's obviously this traumatic scene with another patient. What's interesting is there's sort of this rule, unwritten rule, I think, that it has to be personal to the character that you have, but yet it's not allowed to be too personal to the character. It's always this balance that you're striking. And I see that, and I get this all the time. People think I have no idea how to work an investigation. And they're like, oh, that she'd never be allowed to investigate a crime that involved anyone close to her or herself. It's like, okay, that may be the case, but it's boring. Mm-hmm. So, you're always given a few ideas. And it looks like in this one, you kind of decided to have them just color outside the lines a little bit.
Right.
And how did that work?
Well, yeah, because the patient who is in the beginning of the book, who Sarah works on, there's a connection between that patient and what happened to Sarah 15 years ago. And they know that if they try to investigate it, that officially that will be taken away from them because of the personal involvement. And so Will and Faith and Sarah all try to figure out what's going on, and they're actually not even sure there's a crime. I mean, the thing is, we all love these vigilante stories where the cops are the good guys and they go in and they kick down doors and take names, but you have to have probable cause, right? You have to have a reason to open an investigation. There are all kinds of checks and balances to make sure that cops are doing that, not just, oh, I don't know, running your license plate of the guy who's at your ex-wife's house, which can get you fired, or not that you get fired, but
you get fired and criminally charged.
Well, it doesn't happen though. So, because we just had that happen in Atlanta, and the guy got desk duty for a month. So anyway, I try to, as much as I can, to make sure that I'm following what would be a real life scenario, and so that's why I had them color outside the lines. But they would have gotten in so much trouble. But I can't have that happen because I need them to continue to work for the GBI so I can write about them.
No, that is true, and we have to be allowed a little bit of latitude, but I do. That does always get me when people are like, "Oh, she'd never be allowed to." It's like, okay, but okay. So if I was going to be
fiction,
I know, if I was going to be really authentic, it would be like Sarah would come in, and her supervisor would say, "Okay, you're off the case," and she'd be like, "Okay, goodbye." Then the book's over. I mean, it's like, come on, we need to do that. The other thing, it seems like in fiction, in the very beginning, authors are kind of allowed one coincidence. It's almost like it's like a third rail. You're not allowed to have too many coincidences or really any, but you're allowed one in the very beginning. And I guess in the beginning, in this case, it's the relationship between, her background and this patient that comes through. But it's so deftly done and skillfully done that you don't even think of it that way. And so, I mean, I love how you did that, and you painted it in there. And I also love how you showed the relationship, blossoming between her and Will. It was very sweet and a nice juxtaposition with all the other things that went on later.
Well, maybe you had this happen. I've spoken to a lot of female police officers, a lot of retired ones who are extremely honest ladies. And I said, I always ask them two questions. Why are you doing this job? Because predominantly no one in their lives wants them to do this job, right? Because it's a very difficult job for a woman. And the other question I ask is, what's the best advice you got from another female officer who, was a senior to you? And a lot of the women said that the best advice they got is to find nice men, because when you are a cop, all you see are really bad men, and that you need a nice one to balance that out. Otherwise, you will become a nun and you will hate all men. And a lot of them, it took a long time for them to get that on board, and they ended up marrying fellow police officers and divorcing them, and marrying other police officers and divorcing them. And it's like, why can't I fix him? And so I wanted to make sure that Will was a good guy, because I knew I'd be writing about really bad men, predominantly doing bad things. And that being said, I try to keep it even and kill the same number of men as I do women in my books. Every book I've written where men die, no one cares that they're dead. I mean, I see some guys in here nodding. It's true that your lives have no value in fiction. If you are a woman, you suddenly have a ton of value in fiction if you are a murder victim. And so I do try to keep that in mind, and show with Will and Sarah's father and Charlie and other people who are in the lives of these really strong women, that there's a good balance. And I seldom get credit for it, though. They're out, a lot of times they'll read it and go, wow, these guys are so bad. And I think, well, Will's a really good guy.
No, you do. You write good, strong men, and I notice it, and I'm sure a lot of other people do. And it's important to do that. I agree. And another thing I was thinking about, too, is you kind of, toward the beginning of the book, you showcase a quote and it is remember to speak from the scar and not the wound. And I was going to ask you why you, and it's an anonymous quote, but I was going to ask you why you chose that one and for this book and what you think about that quote.
Well, I found a lot of attributions for that quote. And I actually hired someone who's a professional researcher to try to find out what the original, who originally said that. And he couldn't find anything. I couldn't either. But it's mostly used in trauma counseling. And, victims of crime are women who have been victims of rape, or men and women who have been victims of child abuse. They say to speak from the scar and not the wound, meaning let time heal it a little bit. And it's okay if after a traumatic event you're not ready to talk about it. And I think that's really important. I think one of the things I've always felt about violence, particularly violence against women, is that we should always tell them, no matter what you did, that was the right thing to do, and to let them off the hook. Because, again, if your husband gets murdered, you don't think, wow, what could I have done differently? But if something happens to a woman or a man who's assaulted, then there's all these questions. What did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? Every single person in here who has lived past the age of 20 has made a tremendously horrible mistake in their lives. And you're very lucky that you're still here. And I think that we should just be more forgiving toward people who have bad things happen. And I think that quote really talks about that, just to let yourself heal and give yourself time before you're ready to speak about it.
And another thing, and this is really a quote from you in the book, where, mentioning change tells you who you really are was something that came up. And I was wondering about elaborating about that too.
Well, as I have gotten older, as I've made some really horrible mistakes, as things in my life has changed, Barbara can tell you I still dress the same way though. But as I've really learned from those, and anytime there's change, how you react to it tells you who you are, because either you're going to accept it, either you're going to fight it, or whatever your reaction is. That's a facet of your personality that really informs your worldview. And especially when it's something difficult that happens, I think if you're tested, that tells you what kind of person you really are. I mean, God knows, before I had a root canal, I thought people were really complaining little whiny babies. But guess what? I am a whiny baby. So, small things like that, or larger things, they just can reveal a lot about your personality.
So Karin and I have been together actually since before she was a published author. We had a pre-publication lunch in New York City a long time ago. So I've read Karin in real time, and those of you who've read her earlier books know that Sarah started out married to Jeffrey, right? In a smaller place, not in Atlanta. And so as an author, Karin, thinking about craft, at some point you needed to change something. And to do that, this is no surprise for all of you who read it, but I'll tell you anyways, sacrifice Jeffrey. But there were a lot of things that neither Sarah nor Jeffrey necessarily knew about themselves that you've been able to mine. But then we had Will. Did you always think that Sarah and Will would get together, or did it sort of become inevitable that after you started writing Will that you might bring Sarah back in?
No, I knew from the very beginning that Will and Sarah would meet. Somebody pet that baby.
We're hurrying.
When I wrote when I was writing the fourth Grant County book, I knew how the series would end. And then, so between the fifth and sixth Grant County novel, I wrote the first Will Trent novel. So I very deliberately made Will kind of messed up in Triptych, and he's a man who is in a relationship with a woman who's very abusive, and it's a very toxic relationship. If you've seen the TV show, the Angie in the show is so much nicer than the Angie in the books. And I don't think they'll let Erica would probably love it, the woman who plays Angie, but I don't think they'll let her go that dark. But I wanted to have him be a complicated guy, and then I wanted to spend 2 books, Triptych and Fractured, working on him being the sort of man Sarah would be interested in. And so in Triptych, you don't even really meet him until about 50 pages into the book, and you realize who the driver of the story is, and you get him through the lenses of other characters, and he's really hard to pin down, and he's a kind of guy, unlike a lot of male cops who love flirting, love being the center of attention. They all think they're so charming and irresistible, but they don't realize it's because they've got a gun. But unlike that kind of attitude, particularly in the bigger cases that you can see, Will just wants to do his job and blend in and go home to his dog. And so that was someone I thought would be interesting to write about. He's the polar opposite of Jeffrey, but they both have the same kind of moral compass. And I think you can disagree on a lot of things, like music or movies or whatever, but if you don't have the same moral compass, a relationship really isn't going to be solid. And so I worked very hard on getting him through Fractured when he's partnered with Faith, and you learn more about him and Amanda and his past and all those things, so that by the time you meet Sarah in Undone, you think, oh, wow, there could be something here.
Right, and actually, later in books, we've learned more about Jeffrey being dead, than we knew when Jeffrey was alive. So I had we do serial events on some days, and I had a really interesting conversation earlier today with, I lost his first name, Norton. Anyways, a famous TV host.
Graham Norton.
Graham Norton, thank you very
Like
much. It was great if you want to watch it. But we talked about his process, and I had cheated because I'd heard somebody else ask him about this, so I was informed when I asked his questions. I wasn't going in blind. But basically, for him, he thinks of a situation, and then he thinks about who he might create to be in that situation, to live in that situation. But the interesting part is that none of those characters are real. You know, he creates them, and yet they become so alive for him and eventually for the reader. In the conversation we're just having, Jeffrey and Sarah and Will, they're all from Karin, right? They're real people, and yet we're having a conversation about them as though they're here or they're somewhere right over there, and we know them. And how does that feel for you? I know how Graham said it made him feel. How does it feel for you to have created these people and now they're basically alive? And they probably spend a lot more time in your head than people you actually know.
Yeah, no, they do. They always have, particularly Sarah has been with me so long. And I do feel like they're real people in a weird way. I mean, I know I'm not. Don't worry. They're not real people. But I think of them in that way. And I think good relationships, you learn new things about them. And that's what I try to do in the books, is show those different facets of the relationship. I think Sarah's tone in this book is very personal and very driven in a way that she hasn't shown in a while, and that was a lot of fun for me to write. But it's definitely a facet of her personality that was always there. And I think of each book in terms of, well, who's the focus going to be on? And sometimes it was Faith in one, and, or I'm going to tell you more about Amanda in a book like Criminal. And, I'm really such a marketing genius because ABC has spent so much money promoting Will Trent. And I'm starting a book with Will Trent in the series with Sarah Linton, and you don't really see Will he's in there in the beginning, but you don't really get his point of view for 50 pages. So that was really smart of me. If anybody wants to say I've sold out, I've done it in a really stupid way. But they do feel like real people to me, and they're very solidly in my mind what their likes and dislikes. And when I start thinking about a story that I'm going to write in the series, a lot of times that's my question: is which one is in my mind the most right now, and which one do I want to focus on?
So Isabella pointed out how gripping the opening of this book is. I have a very interesting email from a very long-time fan of Karin's, who is a former police officer and prosecutor. And I'm going to read it because I thought it was just amazing. Wow, she said. She just finished the book, so here's her book review. Wow, she said, just wow. This one has set a record for anxiety pacing, meaning you can see her going up and down the room reading the book and being worried. Then I love this part. I will be interested to see how the reviews by men and women differ. My niece is visiting, and we were talking about how much easier it is to read a mystery about murder, even gruesome murders, than it is to read a book that centers on rape. We concluded that for most people, murder remains an abstract. For me, even though I'm 40 years from dealing with one, but rape or the possibility of sexual assault is a path every woman has walked. So in addition to being a really good book, this one, Karen, is almost a public service announcement. Isn't that a great?
Nice. Yeah.
I love being a bookseller and having readers tell me how they react. But I really, you've touched so many chords that she mentions in that. And I love the idea that, it should be a wake-up call for everybody.
Well, it's funny. I was just in Europe touring with the book, and a male interviewer I've known before, older white guy, you're going to be shocked. He said, boy, one might guess from reading this book that you hate men. And I said, well, you might guess that I hate rapists. And so what are you saying? And just the fact that he couldn't understand the difference between that, I thought was really telling. And it's something the book is about, too. Just that sort of perception that if you say, you can call one woman a crazy bitch and you're not a woman hater, but for a certain type of guy, if you say that man's an asshole, then he's going to conflate that to every single man who has ever drawn breath. That's a problem. That's something that we deal with every single day. And God, when I think about all the emotional energy I spent in my 20s worrying about what men thought and what they felt, if I could get that back, I would be 30. That's and there's something maybe you kind of lighted on. Hopefully you felt it was authentic when Faith is talking to Jeremy, her son, about what it's like to be a female police officer and the amount of crap she puts up with just from the other cops is just enormous. And she just wants to do this job. She's good at it. It's a good paying job, has benefits. She was a single mom. It's one of the few jobs where you're guaranteed to be paid exactly what men are paid for doing the same job. And the extra level, in addition to all the dangers of being a police officer, the extra level of just incredible shit she puts up with to do this job is something that she's never really talked about. She's kind of laughed about it, but to have that written out, I've had a lot of female cops who've been like, wow, I could have that conversation with my child too.
Yeah, I was thinking, get out of my head, Karen. Get out of my head. Well, part of that too, I was going to ask you about Jeremy. Such an interesting character, and I also like Barbara was saying, I think one of the things that makes everything so authentic is the fact that you have an extended cast. It isn't just the main characters, but you give them these fully fleshed out lives and all these other things going on. Jeremy and Aunt Eliza and other people. Oh, and Amanda, who is universally seen as terrifying, kind of like that. But what inspired you about Jeremy and sort of now, I guess, his journey and everything that's going on with him?
Well, I've written about him in past books, and Faith, because she's a mother. She, at 15 years old, she had Jeremy, and it derailed her life and put it on a different path than what she had planned. And usually he's really useful when Faith needs an emotional moment, because, as from a writing standpoint, because Faith is a woman whose main emotion is irritation, which, if you think about being a mother from the age of 15, that's like totally on brand. And she's one of the characters I have to do the most research for, because I don't have any children that I know of, and I don't even like children. No, I'm sure yours are great, but I've never liked them. They have poor motor control. They're sticky, all these things. So I have to read a lot of mommy blogs to see what it's like. And boy, those women hate children too. So I feel right at home It's sort of like it's like being in a terrorist camp, right? And every time I'm so grateful that's not me. But with Faith, I do have to think a lot more about that relationship with her son, and she also has a daughter, and how differently she perceives him. One of the lines she says is something that I talked about with my sister-in-law. When she sent her son off to college, she said, "Don't get a woman pregnant." When she sent her daughter off to college, they sat down and talked for 2 hours about what not to do, who to trust, who not, be careful, all these sorts of things that boys just never get a lesson on. And I wanted to use Faith and Jeremy's relationship as a way to talk about those differences in a book that is about the different ways we treat people.
Yeah, it is. It is very true, and again about the authenticity with which you write. And I was thinking about Grant County, and when you wrote those books, I remember in reading in the past that you had commented that one of the reasons you wanted to make it a fictional place was because you didn't want to constantly be nailed down about, which street runs north and south. And by the way, that happens to me all the time because I write about real places and people will call you on it. But what's funny is you said that people were actually calling you on your accuracy of street directions in Grant County, which is hilarious. How on earth did people get so invested in a fictional county that you created?
Well, at the end of the day, I would just say, show me where you're on a map, what you're talking about. And they wouldn't write back after that. But I get that in Atlanta. And this one woman was so freaking sure. And I'm like, I'm going to go to this street. And it was a one-way street, right? I looked on Google. I went on this. I'm standing on the actual corner. And at that moment, I thought, why do you care? It's fiction. Me, why do you care that this person is so angry at you that this road is... And, it's a 500-page book, and that's the one thing they're picking up on. And I think, just let them have it, right? I mean, if it's that important to them that they write these angry letters, just let them have it. And, it means it happened in the middle of the book, so at least she got that far. And part of me wanted to say, oh, well, if you get to the end, you'll see why that I changed that, or, something to trick her into reading it. But I mean, mistakes get made, and it is fiction, at the end of the day. But when someone tells you you've written it 6 months ago, there's thousands of copies in print. It's like telling someone after the fact your haircut's bad. It's like, okay, well, wait till the next haircut and then tell me. But now is not the time.
I think it's just a testament to how invested people get and the world that you create, the characters, the families, the world, and people get invested in your characters to the point that they get mad at you when your characters do something they think they shouldn't or wouldn't. And I guess sometimes you have to push through that and make your own decisions about what you want your characters doing now and in the future.
Well, I love you guys. I'm so happy you're here, but I never think about you when I'm writing. I want it to be about me and the characters and the choices I think they'll make. And, everybody has an idea of who the characters are and what they do. And I think that's great because that's the wonderful thing about reading books is you get that opportunity to engage your own creative side and imagine what the world looks like and that sort of thing. But for me, I'm just writing what I think this story should be when I'm sitting down and working on something, particularly with Sarah and Will and the people in that because I know them so well.
I agree, especially in books in particular, more so than any other medium that I can think of, the reader and the writer are co-creators. And you are sort of leading them, and then the reader they're filling in a lot of the way there. It's like a bridge, and they meet you. And it's wonderful when it happens and it works. Wouldn't you agree?
I would. I also think, and I'm hesitant to ask this question because I've already said we're never going to be political, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. A lot of writers have struggled with how to deal with COVID. It's an experience that we lived through, and it had implications, and many writers chose to skip it or, move forward or something. Atlanta hasn't got a huge population of writers, unlike, let's say, New York City or Los Angeles or what. So what many of us really know about life in Atlanta is from your books. So there are things going on in Atlanta right now. Are you going to write about them? Are you even thinking about them? Do you think you'll avoid them because they're not over yet? So it's going to be a long time before we know how it goes. But is that something you feel you should touch on, or something not?
I don't
Not
know.
from
I
a
mean, I
political
would never say
standpoint.
never. I would say the last Civil War, Georgia played an important part as well. But I don't really write. I write about things that are called political because, like, suddenly sexual assault is political, or, I mean, like, we should all agree rape is really awful, right? It shouldn't be something people call. I think people say political when what they mean is that's uncomfortable and I don't want to talk about it, or I think we're going to disagree, so I'm going to call it political or woke or whatever word you're going to use. I might touch on it. I mean, if for the very least, because today traffic was horrible. So that's something. I think it would be hard to not obliquely refer to it because this is going to take probably years, and traffic is really going to be bad because of it when they're all flying in and out. So I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of really big cases that have happened in Atlanta, particularly under RICO, but lots of athletes, lots of singers. I mean, we've got a very long RICO trial going on now with a rap artist, and they can't find a jury to seat because the jury pool keeps getting poisoned, and so it's probably going to be something I obliquely refer to. But I mean, honestly, I'm so tired of it. I don't even think if I'm going to write about something, I have to be really interested in it and want to live with it for a year. And we've lived with it so long, I think I need a break.
I didn't think of it as, part of a plot or something. It's just that, it's going to be part of the fabric of Atlanta. And if you're going to write about contemporary Atlanta, even if you slightly touch upon it, I mean, there are major events that not a lot of us don't want to think about or don't want to be part of our lives. But if you're writing about a real city and not, Oz or the Emerald City or something, you have to sort of think about it. So anyway, I think on that political note, that maybe, and I didn't really mean it that way. It was a craft question. It wasn't a political question. Maybe we should ask for questions from the audience.
Yeah, I did promise them. They would
You
have
did?
I did.
All right.
I promised.
All
Okay,
right,
who's
so
got a
take
question
over.
for Karen? Oh, don't be shy. I know you do. Here you go.
Will Trent 6'3", Jack Reacher, I think 6'5", a couple others are like 6. But when they get translated to television, they
Well, can I speak up and say that I once asked Lee Child that when Tom Cruise remembered the movie, and people were so I asked Lee point blank in front of a large audience, what the hell was that? And he said at the time they cast the movie, there were no tall actors who were box office draws. So by default it turned out to be Tom Cruise, even if he's like a foot shorter than Jack Reacher. You can't always choose, the physicality of an actor who is also going to be important enough or new or whatever it is to carry your series. Would you agree with that?
I do. And, the thing is, Will Trent is different for everybody. In Brazil, he speaks Portuguese. So, but at the end of the day, you have to cast a person to play that character. And you could have a tall Swedish guy who doesn't get the character or who doesn't connect with the character. Or you can have someone like Ramon, who I think does a really good job of capturing Will's heart. He's also a very sexy guy. I had dinner with him and I was like, I cannot believe this sexy man is sitting across from me. And everybody else in the restaurant was like, I cannot believe that sexy man is sitting across from her. And he's done so much research. He knows the character very well. He knows all the stories. He has talked to experts in dyslexia. He's worked on that very hard. And he's incredibly professional. And most importantly, he gets along very well with Betty, or Bella, who plays Betty. And also she kind of overshadows him in publicity, and he's okay with that. So it shows his humility. But you're right. We do have in our heads these characters, but you know, that's the great thing about books. I always say the book is the book and the show is the show. And it helps me that they look different, because when I was writing Girl Forgotten, which is sort of a follow up to Pieces of Her, where Toni Collette played the mother in that, Toni Collette looks so much like my idea of the character in the book that I kept having to remind myself, no, write the book Laura, not the Toni Collette Laura. So the fact that they look different, and Faith and Amanda and everybody looks different, is really helpful to me to be able to write the books.
All right, over here.
What got you where you are? Like, how did it start? Was it young? Was it something you came into later? I'm curious, was there a teacher that inspired you to do this?
Absolutely. Well, first, the librarians. And I said I'm Gen X, so I was reading all the classics like Lace and V.C. Andrews, Flowers in the Attic, you know, that kind of trash. And they put good books in my hands, like Gatsby, or Flannery O'Connor was a revelation for me, because I was a very weird young girl, and I was constantly being told I was weird because I was interested in these dark stories, and I had a really dark sense of humor, and they're like, you're never going to find a man to marry you, and I'm like, okay. And then I read Flannery O'Connor, and she was a really strange woman who wrote dark stories, and she never found a man to marry her, but she was okay. And that's why representation matters, I think, because I feel that if these librarians hadn't shown me her work, I probably would have thought, you need to stop doing this, right? It's too weird. But my ninth grade English teacher had the biggest influence on me, because she said to me, you're very good at writing, which I had heard all my life. And then she said, but you could be better. And I'm like, what? And she challenged me. And honestly, she would probably be fired today. She was very opinionated, but all the kids had to come up to her level, and it really just made us excel. And I wanted to please her. And she passed away a few years ago, but I was still in touch with her, and I was there before she died. And she was just continued to be. When I got my book deal, she was the second person I told, behind my dad. And I went to school, which was really small. I thought it would be larger from what I remembered in my memory. But I went to the school and showed her it was written about in a trade magazine, and it said Slaughter signs killer deal. And I showed that to her, and she was just over the moon. Yeah.
Great. Anything else? Okay, back there. I don't know. Okay, whoever stands up first.
Well, for me, they came together organically, because that's what I read in series books. I mean, and even Jack Reacher has a love interest every book. I mean, it's going to be a different one each time. But for me, I thought that was important to show the good side of things as well as the bad. And it's a good balance. And I write about still Sarah's family a lot, and those dynamics, and her sister, and those relationships, because I think it just helps make them feel like more well-rounded, real characters. And to me, that's what I like about reading a series novel, is you just slide back into that familiarity. And, I think I've been secretly writing love stories for a really long time, but no one noticed because of all the murder. So I appreciate you asking that question, because that is a very important part of it for me.
Okay. Yeah, there was. Okay, go ahead. No.
Yep, you.
You right there.
Yeah, I love Kathleen. I actually was in California yesterday and I had lunch with her, and I think she's an amazing reader. So if you're going to say she's not, please be kind. It's Kathleen Early. And yeah, she really captures a lot of emotion with her voice. And I don't often listen to the books because I'm thinking, why did I choose that word? Why did that I'm trying to edit myself. But I listened to her read a bit of a short story once because we were in the studio together. And I thought, my God, she just pulled such emotion from this passage. And I mean, that's such a talent. I'm so happy that she can do such great reading. And, audiobooks are reading too. And so I think it's wonderful that that's a format that's available for anybody, but particularly people like you who's being terrorized at home, to have that moment you give yourself. Because, I mean, that's what a good book does in any format. It gives you a moment to yourself. So I'm all in favor of that.
We have some questions from the online audience, and Isabella's going to give her microphone to Patrick so he can read a few off his phone.
Yeah, Jane would like to know, are you aware of the cop training center to be made in Atlanta?
Yes, I am.
I guess she, well, what do you think about that? And do you have an opinion?
I think it's very controversial. I mean, I don't think that. I know that. I think it's very important to train police officers. And I think that I would love to see the community involved in helping shape that training, and that the values of the community should be reflected in policing. And Atlanta has a very vibrant and diverse police force. And I would like to see us spend more money on training, on different services and different ways that we can help the community in policing.
Same person would like to know, have you ever used police dogs in your books?
I did. So there's just, I don't know if this is in every state, but the cadaver dogs, people do that for fun. They're not really in Georgia. They're not part of the police department. They're just like, well, we need to find a body. What about Bob? Let's see if Old Yeller's ready for training. And they'll give you have to register, and they'll give you the scent of a rotting body so you can train the dog on it. But that being said, they're not super reliable. I mean, a lot of times they light on like a carcass of a deer or something like that, or, some of them are highly trained professionals. Auburn University has a facility where they train bomb sniffing dogs. And I mean, it's a really grueling course. A lot of them wash out. But the cadaver dogs, it's usually just a guy with a hound who likes looking for dead bodies. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, but God bless them, because sometimes, I mean, they do find things, but they're not, I don't think like with Casey Anthony where they're like, well, this cadaver dog smelled a dead body in the trunk. It's like, okay.
No, it's not court admissible in that sort of sense, no.
Correct,
So,
yeah.
And you're right, a lot of them are volunteers.
What about cadaver cats? I guess that wouldn't work.
Well, I think you could have cadaver cats, but they would just eat the bodies. Yeah. Or they'd be like, I know where it is, I'm not telling you.
Right. And stare at you with disdain.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, this may be a spoiler. So Maureen would like to know, can you share why you chose not to address how Sarah coped with returning to Grady after her trauma?
Yeah, I had touched on that a little bit in an earlier book. So it was a ruse to get her to read an earlier book, and I don't remember which one, so she'll have to get all 10. I think when you write about something like sexual assault, you have to pick what aspects you're going to write about. And my grandmother had this great saying that no one likes an angry woman. And I thought it was really important to focus on what Sarah was no longer angry about in the writing. And also, It's Undone is the novel where she talks about going back to Grady. But Grady Hospital in Atlanta is a level 1 trauma center. It's attached to Morehouse and Emory University. And so it's a teaching hospital. And if anything catastrophic happens to you in Atlanta, that's exactly where you want to be. If you have a cold, you're going to wait for 10 hours probably before you see a doctor. But it's a really high energy, high stress kind of place to work, and it draws a certain personality type that Sarah definitely was when she was a younger doctor, and we get to see that a little bit as opposed to how she is now.
Yeah. Anybody in the audience have questions? All right, fine. Let's see. Brittany on YouTube. As an author writing darker stories, what's your escape? Or do you have any tools to take you back into reality? Or is that even an issue?
It's not an issue for me. Maybe because I've never really been out in a uniform and seen the real thing. I mean, I have done a ride along, and I've been to the morgue and that kind of stuff, or the medical examiner's office. But for me, it's always been something. Crime in that area has always been something I'm interested in. And, you know, I have cats. I like to be with my cats and read other books, and I go on the treadmill, obviously not enough. And there are just things I do to take myself out of the story, but most of the time it's always in my head, and I'm always thinking about different plots and different things I can write about. I don't know if you saw this survey. There's something like 20% of people don't have an inner monologue. And I can't imagine living like that because I'm always.
Who are those people?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, because
Mine
I
won't
always
shut
just
up.
assumed everybody's daydreaming, everybody's got this thing going on, but apparently some people don't. Yeah. So yeah, they're probably.
How much you can share, want to share, but for my own peace of mind, because I'm an addict, do you have long-term plans for Will, or is he? Because it's 11 books so far, so I don't know, or if you have more standalones planned, or like what's next?
Well, the next one is a Will and Sarah. I'm working on it now, but I do have long-term plans for them. But I will warn you, I said that about Grant County too, and I was lying. But I'm not lying now. But I do. I always think about 3 or 4 books ahead in the series at a time. So I've got at least that in my head. And usually when I write one, I get more. But I think after this Will and Sarah one for next year, I'll do another standalone. And it just depends. I'm really lucky that my publisher lets me write whatever I want to write. And right now I'm really enjoying writing Will and Sarah books.
And we're all happy about it too.
I'm sure your publisher is happy that Television Will is getting a boost from Book Will and the other way around. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and we've come to the part where I like to give away a couple of books not yet published, because I get an extraordinary number. I have 10 tubs of them in my office currently waiting for space in the back of the bookstore to bring them in. So John, what numbers do we have? Thank you. I can always hear John. I can't always hear everybody else. Thank you very much, John. So let's see. Karin, this is a book called The Death of Us, and you probably know Laurie Rader Day. It's going to come out in October. She's an Edgar Anthony and Mary Higgins Clark Award-winning author. And the book goes, one rainy night 15 years ago, a knock at the door changed Lisa Kehoe's life forever. On that night, Ashley Hayes stood on Lisa's front porch and handed over her brand new baby. Where is it going from there? Would you like to pick a number between 1 and 47? Notice I gave you the baby book.
13.
Okay, so would you pass that back to that lady? That'll be great. All right. This is a British book called Murder in the Family, and it has a really interesting format in that the whole book is told in... I know it's hard for me to read, to be honest, because I'm a speed reader, and so I can't read text messages and photos and, newspaper columns and all. It's sort of like a scrapbook.
I read it. It's really good. I
have
enjoyed
you?
it. Yeah,
Oh,
you
good.
get used to it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so that book is actually out this month. So I'm going to see if Isabella would like to pick a number between one, and the clue is it can't be 13.
Right. Okay. I will say 32.
Yay, it's you, sir, who's patiently stood up and down to try to keep your back flowing, right? I know. I've been really empathizing with you. No, I'll give it to you. Anyway, let's thank our two authors, Isabella and Karin.